This channel supports the use of ad block.
Real-time strategy games are pretty much an institution primarily in the PC gaming universe. There have been many attempts to bring the genre to the much wider console market of the time, but those attempts have usually failed. This has to do with the fact that the RTS has a certain level of irreducible complexity that is incompatible with the general controller inputs that exist with most consoles. Things like being able to whip the cursor from one edge of the screen to the other to scroll the map, the ability to assign control groups, the sheer amount of hotkeys that allow the game to be played at a vigorous pace, and etc. etc. RTS games have several different subgenres, but they largely conform to a few similar concepts, that being unit control and resource management. One such subgenre would be games like Dawn of War 2, or the much underappreciated Swine, which places you in charge of a limited amount of army and resources and tasks you with navigating your way to an objective victory. Some would also consider the old-fashioned city builders and management sims like Settlers and Civ to be offshoots of the RTS genre. But the granddaddy of the RTS genre would be the base building combat type RTS games, or sometimes known as the 4X games. These games involve the gameplay loop of collecting resources, building production buildings, training and constructing armies, and commanding those armies to obliterate anything in your way. Dune 2 and Warcraft can be widely considered as the de facto genre-defining games that laid out the template of what all modern-day RTS games would be in some form or another. But if you were to ask anybody about what is the quintessential RTS game in the entire history of the genre, most would point to one game and one game only: Command and Conquer. Age of Empires. Okay, come on, this is part 3 in a ridiculous series talking about Starcraft. This joke doesn't work anymore. Well, surprise, surprise, I wrote this video first. Released in 1998, the game is still played to this very day with no gameplay updates to it since 2001, and is still played at a fiercely competitive level. And it is this concept of fierce competitive play that keeps the genre alive. But it would be one thing to play competitively in an infrastructure that is designed to be mostly similar. For instance, a game of chess has both players play with identical pieces that perform identical moves. And a totally different thing to have multiple different complex infrastructures within the game itself. And Starcraft has 3. And I'm here to show you just how insane that idea is, and how impossibly perfect it eventually ended up as. The RTS genre always knew that it needed to implement play diversity to generate more content and to increase replayability. At the same time, play diversity also ensured a more interesting competitive element. The way in which these games achieved this at first was by introducing different factions into the game, which allowed for different stories to be told, different unit designs to be introduced, and slightly different styles of play to develop. Dune 2, for instance, introduced the world to 3 different factions, all of which were slightly unique, the keyword there being slightly. Sure, there were unique things about each race. The Atreides had the Ornithopter, Devastators for the Harkonnens, Sabotiers for the Ordos, for example, but core elements of the game were the same. They all built concrete slabs, they all needed the same wind farms, they all used the same harvesters, they shared many similar attack units, and so on and so on. Other games had this same design. The Allies and Soviets in Red Alert had different unit prices and different units and buildings on either side, Tesla coils and light tanks and blah blah blah, but they all needed to build the same power plants, refineries, factories, radars, and so on and so on. Warcraft was also the same. Archers and spearmen had slightly different ranges for their attacks, the necromancers and warlocks had different spells from the clerics and conjurers, but the farms were the same, peons and peasants were the same, most of the units and buildings cost the same amount of resources, and blah 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 blah. Then came along Starcraft, and suddenly, everything was different. I'm getting giddy just thinking about telling you about the million different ways StarCraft introduced a ridiculous level of difference between its three races. And we must first understand how insane the asymmetry is before you can truly appreciate how balanced this game ended up. So,
let's start at the very beginning.
while most games would use the exact same kind of unit to start the resource collection portion of the game, Starcraft already introduced us to three unique ones. The Terrans have SCVs, the Zerg have drones, and the Protoss have probes. They all cost the same, 50 minerals, but that is about where the similarities end. The SCVs have 60 health, drones have 40, probes have 20 shields and 20 health. But wait, there's more. SCVs can be repaired at a cost or be healed by a medic for energy, drones naturally regenerate health, probes regenerate shields but not health and cannot be repaired. But wait, there's more. SCVs have a range of 0 if they attack, essentially making them melee fighters. Drones and probes are ranged. But wait, there's even more! SCVs are required to build a building from start to finish. Drones evolve into the building itself, sacrificing the drone. Probes warp in their buildings, freeing them up to do other things after the initial command. And that's just the resource gathering unit. Let's talk about supply or farms. While most games have similar supply buildings like the farms in the first two Warcrafts or the power plants in the Command & Conquer series, Starcraft decides to be insane even with something as mundane as that. While they all cost 100 minerals and provide 8 supply, the Terrans have this big 2x3 building, the Protoss have a 2x2 building, and the Zerg have a flying unit. The supply depot cannot be moved like some other Terran buildings. The pylon has a secondary function of providing building space, which in the Zerg case is creep provided by the hatchery and creep colonies, and the Overlord has the detector ability, which the Terrans and Protoss only get much later in the game. But here we have to rewind even a little more because the fundamental way in which units are made are just as different as the way each race constructs buildings. Terrans and Protoss built their units from the production structures themselves, but the Zerg hatch all their units from larvae that the hatcheries produce at a fixed interval and can only have 3 at a time per hatchery max. Heck, even the first building you start with is vastly different. They're all the same size. Spoiler, they're not, but they cost different. The command center and nexus cost 400 minerals, while the hatchery costs only 300 plus a drone, which is 50. But it's not just an extra 50 minerals. You have to also factor in the loss of a worker mining minerals. They all have different health, provide a different amount of supply, 10 for the Terran, 9 for the Protoss, and 1 for the Zerg, and do different things. The hatchery has the need to be upgraded and can research the burrow ability, while the command center can lift off and fly away and has add-ons that do different things like scan or build nukes. And then we get to the first army unit. While in Warcraft we have the Footmen and the Grunt that turn out to be almost identical, Starcraft introduces to 3 vastly different units. The Marine, the Zergling, and the Zealot. And they share no similarities across all 3 at all. The Marine is a ranged unit, while the other 2 are melee. The Marine costs 50 minerals, the Zealot costs 100, and the Zerglings are 50 minerals, but they spawn 2 at a time per larva. Marines take 1 supply, Zerglings are 1 supply for both, and Zealots are 2 supply. They all have different health and different damage and different movement and attack speeds. And all Terran units can either be healed by medics or repaired by SCVs, except the SCV itself, which can be both healed and repaired. All Zerg units and buildings restore health very slowly over time, and all Protoss units and buildings have shields which recharge over time or can be charged by a shield battery. The primary buildings where these units are made are also fundamentally different. The barracks cost 150 minerals and can be built anywhere at any time. The gateway is also 150 minerals but requires a pylon to be built first. And the spawning pool is 200 minerals, must be spawned on creep, and allows larvae to be spawned into zerglings. And as we go on, the diversity only increases. Terrans then go on to make the Firebat at the barracks, which require the construction of the academy for another 150 minerals. Firebats are 50 minerals, 25 gas, and 1 supply, and have a short range-ish attack. Protoss require a cybernetics core for 200 minerals that allow them to build Dragoons for 125 minerals, 50 gas, and 2 supply, and they have a massive range attack that the range can be upgraded further at the core. Zerg build a Hydralisk then for 100 minerals and 50 gas and 1 drone, and that allows larvae to turn into Hydralisk for 75 minerals, 25 gas, and 1 supply, and have speed and range upgrades. Then we get to medics and ghosts for the barracks, high and dark templars at the gateway, and the Zerg get weird with lurkers. We're gonna talk about them in a second. And I wanna pause here and tell you, if you are unfamiliar with Starcraft or the RTS genre as a whole, that despite these already overwhelming differences in the 3 races, the game of Starcraft is perfectly balanced. Well, it's not, but it is, and it's hard to explain, but players of the game kind of know exactly what I'm talking about. And I will talk more about that, but I just want you to pause for a second and chew on that, because not only am I not remotely close to describing the exhaustive amount of diversity in the game, but this asymmetry results in perfect balance. I cannot stress that point enough. But let's go on, because I want to tell you everything about how crazily asymmetrical the game really is. Terrans then build their next structure and get vultures and tanks from the factory, which can be built after the barracks is built. Vultures are very fast units and cost only 75 minerals and 1 supply. Tanks, on the other hand, are bulky and slow and cost 100 and take 2 supply and have 2 different attacks which require a siege and unsiege mode mechanic that is unique to not just this race, but this unit specifically. The Protoss respond with Reavers, which are made from the robotics facility, which requires the cybernetics core and a robotics support bay to be made first. Reavers require Scarabs to attack, which cost 25 minerals each and have a build time per Scarab. Again, a mechanic that is not just unique to this race, but this specific unit. Reavers can hold up to 10 Scarabs, but they fire faster than they produce. And as I said earlier, the Zerg get weird with lurkers, which cannot attack unless they are burrowed. Not only that, their burrow animation is also intentionally slower than all the other Zerg units. The Zerg units aren't even consistent within themselves. That's how crazily unique each and everything in Starcraft is. The last of the ground units come in the shape of Goliaths for the Terrans, which attack both ground and air but are incredibly powerful against air units specifically. 2 flavors of Archons for the Protoss, which are made by combining 2 of each of the Templars, resulting in either a spellcasting Dark Archon or a powerful almost all-shield short-range Archon, and the insanely powerful spellcasting Defiler and the monstrous melee Ultralisk for the Zerg. Then we round up the army compositions with flying units, of which the differences between the units are equally insane, if not more insane. Terrans enter the fray with Wraiths, which can hit both air and ground and can cloak, a dropship that can carry units around, a science vessel that doesn't attack, casts spells and has the detector ability, a battlecruiser which is big and chonky and slow as hell and can also attack both air and ground, and the Valkyrie, which can only attack air and does a significant amount of splash damage. The Protoss declare war with a Scout, which is ridiculously expensive and can shoot both air and ground, a shuttle that ferries their units around like the dropship, an Observer, which is a cloaked detector. Yeah, that's a thing. A carrier that houses a bunch of tiny little ships that do its attacking for it that must be manufactured one at a time by the carrier. A Corsair that only attacks air and does splash, and the Arbiter, which can attack but has a far better use as a spellcaster and also gives all the units around it a veil of cloaking. The Zerg get weird again with the suicide bombing scourge, which are produced 2 at a time from a single larva, then the staple mutalisks, which are some of the most terrifying units in the game and damage both air and ground, and instead of another unit to ferry their units around, the Zerg just shove units into the Overlord. Yeah, they shove units into the supply unit. And then there's the Queen, which is a flying spellcaster, and the Guardians and Devourers, which mutate from existing mutalisks and only attack ground and air respectively. Deep breath. If you're an RTS gamer or a Brood War player in particular, all of this seems normal to you, but if you're not, allow me to recap. Terrans have a total of 13 different units at their disposal, the Protoss have 14, and the Zerg have, are you counting? I've listed 12, but there are actually 14? I'll get into that later. And basically no two units have anything in common, and that's just the tip of the iceberg here. Okay, let me allow you some comfort after all of that information. There are some things that are constant among the 3 races. Number 1, all races have the same ability to transport units via a flying unit. Number 2, all races have 1 building and 1 unit that acts as a detector. And number 3, all races have units that attack only ground or only air. And that's it. But even those similarities have different paths that are required to get there. So allow me now to demonstrate the insanity of tech trees and how even more insanely asymmetrical this game becomes. What is a tech tree? A tech tree is basically the path of progression each race needs to take to produce its more advanced buildings and units over time. The Terrans, for instance, require barracks to build a factory, to build a starport, to build a science facility, and so on and so on. Every unit also has a required tech progression in order to build it from a particular building, like the tank requires the machine shop add-on to the factory, for example, and the path to the battlecruiser, perhaps the endpoint of tech for the Terrans, looks something like this. The Protoss path to a similar level of tech, the carrier, would look like this. And let's stick to flying tech for the Zerg and see the path to Guardians. As you can see, the number of steps to each particular unit is never constant, even considering the fact that the units aren't necessarily equal in terms of their power or even their strength in terms of tech. But it gets weirder than that. To understand tech trees, we must also understand the entire infrastructure of each race. Let us prop up a similar statistic like the one we used earlier. The Terrans have a total of 18 buildings they can produce, 6 of which are add-ons that are attached to their designated building, i.e. the machine shop is built by the factory, the control tower by the starport, etc, etc. The Protoss have 16 buildings in total. The Zerg also have 16, however 5 of them are evolutions from existing buildings, which means they essentially spawn 11 buildings from drones, i.e. Hatchery evolves into Lair, Creep Colony evolves into either Sunken Colony or Spore Colony. And with that in mind, let us attempt to explain the crazy asymmetry of both the infrastructure and the tech trees involved by using a simple example I cited earlier. Every race has a building that acts as a detector. Essentially, these are the only things in the game that can see cloaked or burrowed units. These buildings are all static defense buildings, the missile turret for the Terran, the photon cannon for the Protoss, and the Spore Colony for the Zerg. But even that starts to lead us down a rabbit hole when you understand that both the Terran and Zerg versions attack only air, and the photon cannon doubles as both ground and air static defense. For ground static defense, the Zerg has the option of the Sunken Colony instead, which does evolve from the same building but has a different tech tree requirement and does not gain the detector ability, and the Terrans have bunkers which don't do anything unless you shove units into it. And the tech trees to each are wildly different. The Protoss path to its first detector and static defense is the most straightforward. It starts with a pylon, which is required to generate the psionic matrix, a blue field of a particular radius around the pylon that becomes the only buildable space for the Protoss. They can then warp in a forge in that field, and then a photon cannon right after that. Ta-da! The Terrans have an even easier time getting to detectors. They build an engineering bay and then immediately have access to the missile turret. But remember, the missile turret doesn't act as ground static defense. For that, they require a bunker and units to put inside it. This requires first a barracks to be built, which then allows the bunker to be built, but it must then be filled up with up to 4 units in order for it to actually function as a static defense. The Zerg path to both detector and static defense begins with a creep colony, which does nothing except expand the creep, the buildable space for the Zerg, but can evolve into the aforementioned static defense buildings. To morph into the detector version that attacks air, the Zerg must build an evolution chamber. To morph the ground defense version, they require a spawning pool. But now comes the fun with the one little extra detail: the cost of it all. Here is the Protoss cost. This is the cost for the Terrans, and this is the cost for the Zerg. However, if you factor in the cost to also create ground static D for the Terrans, that would involve another 150 minerals for the barracks, 100 for the bunker, 200 for 4 marines, and maybe another 100 for the supply depot required to make those marines. That's a whopping 550 minerals just to get a fully stocked bunker. The Zerg, on the other hand, require a drone to make a spawning pool for 200, another 75 for another creep colony, and then mutate that one for 50 to a sunken colony, which makes a grand total of extra 425 minerals. So, if you were to attempt to compare the tech tree required to get to comprehensive static D and also a detector for every race, you'll end up with 550 minerals for the Protoss to get 2 photon cannons. Let's be fair, since the Terrans and Zerg need 2 buildings to attack both air and ground. 750 minerals for the Terrans to get a fully manned bunker and 1 missile turret, and 725 minerals for the Zerg to get a sunken and a spore colony up. And just from those statistics, suddenly you see why the Protoss developed the cannon rush very early into the metagame, and the Terrans then figured out they could bunker rush too. And the Zergs don't have such a thing called a sunken colony rush, because that would be stupid and insane, because you can't build off of creep. Well, unless you build a hatchery first. Wait, hang on. But of course, resources aren't the only thing that matter here. That's just one way that we can show how different the tech trees and infrastructure are between the 3 races. As you can already tell, the 3 different approaches to static D create 3 different approaches to the game itself. The Terrans and Protoss, for example, can build their buildings anywhere on the map, the Protoss having to build a pylon first. So the static D can actually exist anywhere on the map, whereas the Zerg buildings only exist on creep, which means they only ever exist in the base of the Zerg. Then of course, the Terran version of the ground static D is technically 4 units, which means they can move around freely if they're not defending. Then there's this whole detector business. Why even want detectors anyway? Well, the first cloaked units for the Protoss are technically Dark Templars, which require the gateway, then the core, then the assimilator for gas, then the Citadel of Adun, then the Templar archives, and then you can build Dark Templars. The first cloaked unit for the Terrans are the Wraiths, which start with the barracks, then refinery, then factory, then starport, then control tower, then cloak upgrade, then you get cloaking Wraiths. The Zergs, however, don't technically cloak, but one of their most dangerous units is the Lurker, which can only be seen when they're burrowed by detectors. But there are also other things that will require your detecting. Terrans have Ghost, that is also another cloak unit, but more than that, they also have the Vultures that can plant spider mines all over the place that are technically burrowed. Zergs can plant little Zerglings burrowed around the map, and they won't only act as little spies, but they can also prevent you from building anything on top of them until you get rid of them. And then the Protoss detectors are cloaked, which you will need to detect them to stop them from detecting. Couple all this with the fact that each race has moving detectors as well, the science vessel, the observer, and the overlord, and you can start to see how strategies evolve around just the mechanic of invisible units alone. You can rush for cloaked units, but clearly not against the Zerg. You'll need observers to fend off lurkers, but the Zerg will need to bring overlords to see those observers to shoot them down to protect the lurkers, but the overlords are slow and need to be upgraded to move faster, and if they are shot down, you don't just lose the detector, but remember you lose 8 supply as well. The Terrans need the vessel, but they can also just build missile turrets anywhere on the map, and they have spider mines, and they are sort of burrowed, and surprise, surprise, they have a third way of detecting which other races do not have. They have a scan ability for 50 energy from a command center add-on called the Comset Station, which requires the barracks and an academy to build. And again, I need to pause here and tell you, this game is perfectly balanced. How insane is that? Wait, I'm not done. I have 2 more tidbits that I totally forgot to add. First is building sizes across all 3 races. Terrans have the largest buildings by far out of all the 3 races. Protoss sits somewhere in the middle, and Zerg have the smallest buildings out of all 3. For example, the structure for the Terrans to upgrade their basic infantry, the engineering bay, is a huge 3x3 building, while the Protoss Forge and Zerg evolution chambers are only 2x3. The Zerg building for flyers is even smaller, being only 2x2. Basically, all the production structures for the Terrans are 3x3, the barracks, factory, and starport, while the gateways and stargates are also 3x3 for the Protoss. The robotics facility is only 2x3, and the buildings the Zerg needs to start hatching units are all 2x3 or smaller. Heck, even the supply depots for Terrans are large 2x3 buildings, whereas the Protoss pylons are only 2x2, and the Zerg don't even have to care about those. And on top of this, Terran buildings almost always need add-ons, which is an additional 2x2 structure attached to the right side of the building in order for that particular building to produce specific units. Yeah, that's right. Each factory needs a machine shop if it wants to produce siege tanks. But this kinda ties into the second thing I forgot to mention. Terran buildings are the only buildings you can repair, just like the units. Zerg and Protoss buildings also behave the same as their units, and not only can you repair all Terran mechanical units and structures, but it can also be done using multiple workers to make things go faster. You can effectively surround an entire building with SCVs to repair it from damage. This is, however, offset by the fact that Terran buildings also burn down when below a certain amount of hit points, about a third of the way down. When a Terran building is burning, it loses HP very slowly if it isn't repaired. So not only does it not go back up naturally like the other 2 races in some capacity, it actively goes down if left unattended when damaged. The fact that these basic infrastructural differences exist means that each race cannot be approached in the same way. The way in which buildings are placed also is required to be different. Terrans have to account for their large supply and production buildings, while Protoss need to have some pylons all over the place to keep their buildings functional. Oh, I forgot to mention that if the pylon goes down, the buildings in its field can no longer function. And Zergs can just bunch up all their buildings in one corner because all units are produced from the hatchery. Overlords are required for supply, but they are also crucial as detectors and are susceptible to air attackers like Corsairs, so you can just build them and bunch them up safely in the corner, but they have to be controlled as part of the army too. And yet, it's all balanced. Okay, we must go even deeper because we must now consider the asymmetry of the spells in this game. The only thing that is similar across the races is that each of them has at least one unit that does not attack and only cast spells or abilities for energy. The Terran has the Medic and the Science Vessel, the Protoss has the High Templar and the Dark Archon, and the Zerg has the Queen and the Defiler. But it's not enough to just consider those units, because almost every unit has an ability in this game, whether it is a passive or an active one. So let's go down the list. The Marines and Firebats have Stimpaks researched at the Academy that allow them to sacrifice 10 health for an insane DPS and movement speed boost. The Zealot has a movement speed upgrade at the Citadel, the Zerglings have a movement speed upgrade at the spawning pool, and then an insane attack speed upgrade after the Hive is made. This upgrade is so insanely powerful at this point that they have been given the nickname Cracklings because it's like Zerglings on crack. Medics can heal to start with, but can be upgraded at the Academy to have a blinding flare that reduces vision of that unit to nothing and removes the detector ability, and a restoration ability that removes any status effects, like blind, from a single unit. Ghosts have Cloak by default but can have Lockdown upgraded at the Covert Ops add-on for the Science Facility that allows them to temporarily disable mechanical units, but they can also launch nuclear missiles built at the Nuclear Silo add-on for the Command Center. Dragoons have a range upgrade at the core as I mentioned, High Templars have an area damage spell called Psionic Storm and the ability to create hallucinations of their units which appear normal to the enemies but do not deal actual damage. Then the Dark Templars are permanently cloaked, and the Dark Archons can perform Mind Control, which gives permanent control of an enemy unit at the cost of energy and the shields of the Dark Archon. They can also cast Maelstrom, which stuns an area of units for a time, and they have Feedback, which deprives enemies of their energy and deals an equal amount of damage to that unit for every point of energy depleted. The Hydralisks have movement speed and range upgrades at the Hydralisk Den, and can then have the Lurker mutation upgraded after the lair is made. Oh, and almost all Zerg ground units can burrow after it is researched at the hatchery. Lurkers, however, can burrow anyway because that's how they attack. We're not done. Vultures have speed upgrades and the Spider Mine ability, which gives every vulture 3 non-replenishable mines that are burrowed and come out automatically and explode when a unit gets near it. You can't control these mines, and for some extra cool reason, enemy vultures don't trigger mines either. Tanks must have their siege mode upgraded at the machine shop, and Goliaths have a range upgrade. Wraiths can have Cloak upgraded, Science Vessels have a defensive matrix which reduces all incoming damage to 1 on any unit, Irradiate which damages an organic unit over time and also a short range of units around that unit, and an EMP which depletes all energy and shields in a targeted area. Then Battlecruisers have the Yamato Cannon upgrade, which is a single blast of extremely high range and damage. The Valkyries don't have upgrades per se, but have an insane area of splash damage. Reavers can have their total Scarab reserves upgraded from 5 to 10, Shuttles have a speed upgrade, and Observers have a speed and vision range upgrade. The Scout has a vision upgrade, literally the most useless upgrade in the game, and the speed upgrade at the Fleet Beacon. The Carriers can upgrade the number of little ships, interceptors that they carry from 4 to 8, the Corsairs have splash damage as well as a Disruption Wet upgrade that allows them to halt all range damage from those trapped underneath it. And of course there is the Arbiter, which gives Cloak to all the units around it and has the ability to stun units with a stasis field, but unlike Lockdown or Maelstrom, the units in stasis cannot be attacked. And they also have one of the best Protoss abilities, Recall, which allows the Arbiter to summon a group of units to its location from anywhere in the map. Overlords have speed and vision range upgrades and also need to be upgraded to act as unit carriers. Mutalisks can evolve into either Guardians or Devourers once the Greater Spire is evolved from the Spire after the Hive is made from the lair from the hatchery. On top of that, Mutalisk range attacks bounce up to 2 times, dealing 1 less damage per bounce. Devourers have the Acid Spore passive ability, which stacks up to 9 times and hampers a unit's attack speed and increases the total amount of damage that unit takes per spore. The Queen has the ability to ensnare, which makes a group of units move real slow and attack slower too. They can also cast Parasite, which gives the Zerg the vision of the targeted enemy unit. This Parasite is permanent and can only be removed by the medic's restoration ability or, by death. And lastly is the Spawn Broodling ability, which kills a targeted unit and spawns 2 Broodlings, which are Zerg melee units that have a timed lifespan. Oh, and they can also do this weird thing called infesting a command center, which allows the Queen to go inside a damaged command center and turn it into a Zerg building that can still fly and produces another suicidal unit called the Infested Terran. That's why I told you the Zerg unit count was weird earlier. There are 2 more units here that can only be produced in unique circumstances. The Ultralisk has a speed upgrade and an insane armor upgrade at the Ultralisk Den, and it is the only ground unit that cannot burrow. It makes sense since it's canonically very, very large, but then we have the Defiler. It has Consume, which allows it to eat another Zerg unit and gain energy equivalent to the amount of health that unit had. They can also cast Plague, which affects an area and damages all units and buildings it affects over time them until they hit 1 HP, and since Terran buildings burn down once they reach critical HP, you can technically destroy Terran bases completely with Plague. Fun! And then there's Dark Swarm. Dark Swarm is one of the most powerful abilities in the entire game. It protects the Zerg units underneath it, but not from all types of damage. It works in a kind of a weird way, making units underneath it miss, but that means that splash damage still works, sort of. And that's all the unit abilities, and none of them are remotely similar. But wait! There's more! Because there are also building abilities. Yes, that's right, some buildings can do things too. The Terrans, for instance, have that scan ability at the Comsat Station add-on I talked about earlier, and the nuclear silo that can house a single nuke at a time for 8 supply. You launch these nukes with ghosts. The Protoss have shield batteries that can recharge a unit's shield for energy, and the Zergs have this wonderfully insane building called the Nidus Canal, which allows you to create this almost like a teleportation wormhole on any 2 patches of creep. Zerg goes in one side and it pops out the other side instantly. And the crazy thing is that almost all of these abilities and structures have a use in competitive multiplayer. Professionals have found uses for almost every single one of these abilities and have woven them into the competitive meta. Yes, let's take a brief moment here to talk about the meta. You see, the word meta here means different things to different people. The basic premise of it is that there exists a game outside the game, a meta game. The game itself is the mechanical execution of the commands during play, and the metagame that exists around it is the shared understanding of the strategic approach to the game. Which units counter which build orders counter which build orders, what moves outperform what moves, and so on and so on. The meta as it pertains to Brood War is an ever-growing, ever-evolving conglomerate of professional knowledge built up over years and years of competitive play at the highest level. And the most magical thing about it is that it is continuously evolving until this very day, like literally today that I'm recording this, and even maybe today as you are hearing this, more than 20 years after the game first debuted, is still coming up with new strategies and new implementations of the same collection of buildings, units, and abilities. The meta is the balance of the game. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but for now, understand this once more. Starcraft Brood War is perfectly balanced. Well, it isn't. As the past 12 pages or so have tried to show you, nothing about Brood War is actually balanced, and yet it is. Out of the chaos and creativity of the developers and with the persistence and creativity of the players came a perfectly balanced game that has seen an almost equal dominance and equal opportunity of success for all 3 of its races. When you consider all of the things I have shown you so far, the fact that the state of Brood War remains competitive to this day is insanely remarkable. But wait, there's more! So far, what I've tried to show you is the obvious way that StarCraft Brood War remains one of the most impossibly asymmetrical RTS games ever made. But there are also a ton of details that aren't explicit in the game and are insanely minute and detailed and are almost completely invisible to the casual observer and are only privy to those who go looking for them. Let's start right back at the beginning with the SCV, the probe, and the drone. Yes, they are fundamentally different units as we have already seen, but they serve the same purpose primarily, right? They gather resources. You would think that since all races start with 4 workers each, that all 3 races would be in exactly the same place at the same time for the start of the game. And you'd be completely wrong. The rate at which each unit mines minerals and gas is actually totally different. A fact you would never really realize if only playing the game casually, and the fact that you might have suspected if you played all 3 races a significant amount of time, and the fact that you are only finally certain once confirmed by actual sources or data mined from the game itself. While in reality all 3 of the workers move and accelerate at exactly the same speed, something that, by the way, even some senior players will argue is not true, the actual shape and size of the main building is slightly different in each instance, causing the rate at which the workers gather resources to be ever so slightly different. SCVs will gather 65 minerals per minute, while drones will gather 67.1 minerals per minute, and probes gather 68.1 minerals per minute optimally. This fact isn't explicitly stated in the game, and the difference, as you can see, is relatively minute to a point where you probably never noticed it before if you weren't really into the game. A slightly more obvious, but again much less explicit way in which the game explores these tiny differences is in build times. Hey, editing bay side note here, I don't know where the hell I got these stats from when I was writing this script, but now that I'm editing this video like years after the fact, I don't know where I got these numbers from, so yeah, take it for what you will. Anyway, I'll be pulling images from Wikipedia as reference. Even something as simple as the supply building / unit presents totally different build times. The pylon has a build time of 18.9 seconds, the supply depot takes 25.2 seconds, and the overlord is done in 25 seconds flat. Yes, we're dealing in tenths of a second here, but we're going down to the level of in-game frames here to talk about the asymmetry that exists in Brood War. Barracks and spawning pools take 50.4 seconds each to build, but the gateway takes only 37.8 seconds to build. The Zealot is built in 25.2 seconds, the Marine in 15.12 seconds, and the Zergling in 18 seconds flat. Even the units that basically do the same function, the Dropship, Shuttle, and Overlord, have totally different build times. Overlords are 25 as mentioned, but the Dropship takes 31.5 seconds to build, and the Shuttle takes 37.8 seconds to build. And when you think about it, you now have to balance this imbalance with the already existing imbalance of the infrastructure that I described in part 2, which is starting to sound like an impossible balancing act. How is this game balanced at all? It almost makes no sense how these tiny little numbers all add up to make each race equally viable at taking out any other race. There's more. Some of the statistics in the game are so obscure, and it's almost impossible to know that they exist at all unless you're actually studying the game, which many pros have. One of those is damage types, a set of data that eventually became explicit to the player in games like Warcraft 3, but were already existing in Brood War, but never once demonstrated explicitly to the player. Brood War actually employs 3 different kinds of damage: normal damage, concussive damage, and explosive damage. At first it seems easy to understand, right? Normal damage deals equal damage to all unit sizes, concussive damage does full damage against small units, 50% against medium units, and 25% against large units. And explosive damage deals full damage to large units, 75% to medium units, and 50% to small units. Protoss shields take full damage from all damage types, which changes how you have to view the total health of all Protoss units. Now, the funny thing is that there is also nothing in the game that explicitly tells you what size a unit is. And as if that wasn't weird enough, even more imbalanced is the distribution of the damage types across the races. Concussive damage, for instance, is a damage type that exists only among 3 Terran units: the Firebat, the Ghost, and the Vulture. And most Terran units actually deal explosive damage, While most Zerg units deal normal damage, some units deal different types of damage depending on whether they are attacking air or ground units. Goliaths, for example, deal normal damage to ground units and explosive damage to air units. Marines deal normal damage to both air and ground, but Hydralisks deal explosive damage to both air and ground. And Hydralisks are 1 supply each, but are counted as medium-sized units, while Zealots are considered small, even though they take 2 supply. None of this makes any sense, but wait, there's more! There are some details that are so obscure that it would blow your mind that there are actually slight differences built into them. Take for example the cloak ability. Both ghosts and wraiths have the ability to cloak, and so you would assume that these abilities are identical, right? Wrong! While energy regenerates at a standard rate of 8 out of 256 units per frame, the cost of cloaking a ghost is 10 out of 256 units per frame, while the cost of cloaking a wraith is 13 out of 256 units per frame. Another weird difference that's built in is unit sight ranges. Not all units see equally. Zerglings have a sight range of only 5, while Marines and Zealots have a sight range of 7. Even the detectors are slightly different. Overlords and Observers have a sight of 9 that can then be upgraded to 11, while the Science Vessel has a sight of 10. And there are a ton more tiny little details here and there that totally affect how the game is played, even down to how each and every unit is ultimately controlled and its potential maximized. Every unit, for example, has a different cooldown for their attacks, which affects the overall DPS, but they each also have a pre-attack animation and an actual attack animation. A good example of this is the Dragoon, which has a significantly long animation before it actually starts shooting. It is so long, in fact, that it's very much possible to override the attack while the goon is mid-animation and cancel the attack altogether. Learning these timings is crucial to controlling the Dragoon effectively. Some units have the opposite ability, in which they can perform an attack without even needing to stop movement or have a pre-attack animation at all. Mutalisk and Vultures, for instance, can perform an attack immediately as they start decelerating, which then allows them to immediately start accelerating again. With good enough control, these units don't even lose any speed at all and can basically continually perform their attacks while in movement. Then there's also the weird concept of the actual attack animations themselves and how these affect the damage calculated. The prime example of this being the Zealot, which is advertised as having 16 damage, but is actually done across 2 swift stabs of their Psyblades. This strangely unique problem means that the Zealot is not actually doing 16 damage, but 8 damage twice, which means that the armor protection that is calculated twice per Zealot. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop here for one last time and tell you that Brood War is basically perfectly balanced. And then I'm gonna tell you that there is a shit ton more. There are things like movement type, unit turn rates, acceleration and deceleration quantities, different kinds of splash damage and their damage calculations, unit collision boxes and how they are calculated, and the list goes on and 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 on. If you were to take a look at the history of Brood War, you will very quickly see that while certain eras of dominance existed, the game itself is pretty evenly distributed in terms of the success of each of the races at climbing to the top. Part of this is the way in which pro players have chosen to approach a game like Brood War. While the original Starcraft developers have to be credited with playtesting the crap out of the game and doing their best to create a truly balanced, asymmetrical playing experience, the players also have had a huge hand in ultimately leveling the playing field. When the game first came out, nobody understood what this laundry list of minute details could ultimately mean for how each race would perform in a head-to-head match. You can see this in the way strategies evolved as more of these details became known to the larger player base. Many people began with the now historical pop culture reference Zerg Rush strategy, the Zerglings being one of the fastest ways to start dishing out damage to the opponent. In fact, it's a strategy that is still in the rotation of professional players to this very day, though its success rate may have dwindled significantly, and it is now very much a gamble to use in a more serious head-to-head matchup. What happened with the Zergling Rush is basically the story of every single evolution of strategy in the entire history of the Brood War meta. A strategy is discovered that gives a particular edge to one of the races and their perceived imbalance, and due to an incredible phenomenon of player loyalty and persistence in their race of choice, people set to work trying to figure out how to counter that particular strategy. That's right, instead of crying NERF or IMBA! Well, they still did, and one of the most significant balance patches that resulted was the change of the cost of the spawning pool from 150 to 200. And instead of jumping ship to the perceived more powerful race at that point in time, what the more serious players of the game decided to do was dig in their heels and work even harder to figure out if these strategies could be fought off or countered. One of my favorite stories of the meta developing in a new and monumental way is the Bisu era of Brood War. As Day9 once said, there was a time before Bisu and a time after Bisu when we talk about the Protoss vs Zerg matchup. You can go watch Day9's video, I'll link it in the description for more details on the story, but what Bisu did was basically make the Corsair the very first unit to go up against the Zerg. Yes, ignore the ground game altogether, ignore the Zergling Rush, ignore the Hydras, ignore the Zealots and the Dragoons, just go straight to Corsairs and hunt down enemy overlords. And the Zerg, without anything to defend against that, could only respond by going for Scourge. So if you are someone who's just starting out the game of Brood War, this style of play would make absolutely no sense to you. But it is truly such an ingrained part of the PvZ meta that it is almost inescapable now. Many other professional players would contribute and ultimately shift the meta forever. Players like I Love Oof, Savior, Bisu, and of course, Flash. And that trend is continuing till this very day, with newer players like Mini, Royal, and Soma pushing the meta in different directions each time they whip out a new build order, or a mind game trick, or a little corner cutting in each of their games. I love this little quote from Esports Heaven in one of their 2017 articles. Here's what it says: Brood War was never balanced. There was a certain magic about the development of the metagame with minimal developer involvement that cannot be replicated in the current climate. Something is powerful, you shout obscenities at the developers, and 2 weeks later, it's fixed, only for something else to break. But only in the universe of old could we shift the tides enough to make something useless seem overpowered. Only then were brilliant minds so influential that not only would tiny tweaks incomprehensible to the average mind and player cause an influx of superior results for a race, but it would shift the metagame entirely, forcing intuitive counters to counter-counters and constantly push the threshold of strategical development. We may see mechanical prodigies grow and develop, and even strategic masterminds in their own right, but it is unlikely we will see tactics defy the rules and standards of the game and community in the way we did with our happy little accident that is Brood War, and the patient scene behind it that valued innovation and critical thinking over validation and instant gratification. This is such a perfect summary as to why the game of Brood War is the most perfectly balanced game of all time. Yes, it does also come down to some of the most minute details that the developers tweaked in the game, like attack rates and build times and all that, some of them down to the frames of the game itself, but the balance of Brood War was also created by a dedicated player base that refused to remain frustrated with the flaws of the game and instead used their love and passion for the game to turn it into one of the most complete and competitive RTS games the world has seen, and perhaps we'll never see a game like this ever again. They didn't look at the Zerg race and throw their hands up in the air and cry unfair. They looked at the situation and said, we need to be better. They didn't give up when cannon rushes seemed like an unavoidable loss. They said, we'll fight back. They didn't look at the clunkiness of the Terran and break down. They said Slayer's Boxer is clearly cheating. The players believed in the potential of each race to be a viable competitor, and they stuck with their guns long enough to make sure the metagame accounted for a perceived imbalance. The one other unspoken element that contributes to the balanced meta of Brood War that I'd like to mention is the evolution of balanced maps for head-to-head competition. You see, Starcraft launched with a series of maps from anywhere between 2 to 8 players, and they are all terrible. They're all bad. They were all created without necessarily intending to be perfectly fair for all races in all spawning positions. Some of them had mineral and gas patches that were unevenly distanced from spawn to spawn. Some of them had poorly distributed high ground and low ground. Some had locations that were easily exploited by some of the individual units and their abilities, and so on and so on. The maps themselves were fundamentally broken and required fixing by the mapmaking community. Things like ramps had to be fixed to allow orientation in all directions, since the original assets only pointed in 2 directions. Neutral doodads were used to allow proper walls to be built. Okay, let me pause for another second here, just to tell you the way in which StarCraft walls are built with buildings is an exact science. Just because you put 2 buildings together does not mean that units cannot walk through them. This technique of building proper blocking walls in all the different assortment of positions for all the different races is adorably known as a SimCity. You can go look it up, it's really cool. And of course, earlier maps did not account for a part of the game that would become essential to the basics of the meta: expanding. Some early maps didn't even have more than 1 expansion, and some didn't have gas expansions at all. The very concept of what a 2-player or 4-player map would look like would evolve along with the meta itself, and the pool of maps now also acts as a balancing agent alongside the meta and the game itself. And of course, it cannot go without mention. The very last balancing agent of all of this would be the sheer difficulty of playing the game. Unlike its sequel, Starcraft isn't a particularly well-made game. I hope I've made that clear by now. In my previous video on esports, I highlighted the fact that Starcraft was a game with a ton of coding shortcuts that meant the game wasn't particularly easy to navigate at a very high level. The way units moved and the amount of management you had to do and the much more basic level of AI in the game all meant that actually playing the game was a battle in itself. Players had to basically wrestle the game into submission, which meant that the potential of each race was also very much on the players and their meticulous executions just as much as it was on the internal game mechanics. Just like a fighting game, players had to make sure they executed well-timed build orders and perfect control over stubbornly difficult to control units. If everything was easy to do, then the imbalance of the game would certainly play a much bigger factor in the viability of each race. It's kind of what's happening with StarCraft 2. But StarCraft Brood War is hard, but that's also what makes it so much fun to play and to watch. And that is also what keeps it balanced. So much depends on the raw skill of the player and not the internal balance of the game. You know, looking at all of these facts, it's actually kind of hard to claim that the game was truly designed to be this way from the get-go, especially considering that the last balance patch for Brood War was released in 2001. It might be damn near impossible for the developers to have predicted all of the different ways players would approach playing all 3 different races and have fine-tuned all of these details to allow for all the organic shifts in the meta. At the same time, one can only marvel at how well fine-tuned the game is indeed, allowing for such competitive play even 20-odd years after the last balance patch was introduced. It has to be a mixture of great foresight and insane luck that Brood War turned out this way. So I guess the claim that Starcraft is perfectly balanced isn't totally accurate. Well, it isn't balanced at all, to be honest. Don't show Artosis this video. Or do, maybe his reaction will be hilarious. All the pros are hurling things at their screen right now, but for the casual viewer, what I should be saying is that Starcraft Brood War maintains its balance perfectly, despite being more than 25 years old. We mustn't forget that the game itself is ridiculously fine-tuned, but the dedication of the community of players and mapmakers take that finely tuned machine and perform the perfect tightrope walk again and again and again. And while its star in the world of esports is no longer shining quite as bright, it remains as one of the most competitive, most exciting, and most strategically complex games ever made. And if you're willing to dive deep into its lore and development and evolution through the years, if you're willing to take the time to have your mind blown by some of the meta-changing moments in the game's history, you're in for an insane ride that is more rewarding than any other esport in the world right now. Perfectly balanced, perfectly imbalanced, as all things should be.